Every camera on Earth right now is pointed at the Strait of Hormuz, at Geneva, at Kyiv, at Taipei. And I understand why. Those are the loud stories. But I want to take you somewhere nobody is looking this week, to an island with 57,000 people, almost none of whom you could pick out of a lineup, governed by a country that is, on paper, one of America's closest allies in the world. Because 3 days ago, on June 17th, 2026, one of the most respected investigative journalists working today, a Pulitzer Prize winner, a staff writer at The New Yorker, published a piece that should have been the biggest story of the week and instead barely made a ripple because it was competing for attention against a literal act of war. The piece is titled, "Inside the Ludicrous, Deadly Serious Plan to Take Over Greenland." And in it, journalist Ben Taub makes a claim that I think deserves to sit right alongside everything we've discussed in this series about soft power playbooks, civil society influence operations, and the machinery of regime-adjacent pressure campaigns. He says in his own reporting, backed by his own sourcing, that there are ongoing influence operations conducted at Trump's direction, specifically designed to keep the possibility of acquiring Greenland alive, right now, in the summer of 2026, even though the story has largely vanished from the headlines. Here's why I think this matters more than almost anything else happening this week, even with everything else going on. Every other story in this series has involved a toolkit, civil society funding, media influence, financial pressure, NGO infrastructure, being discussed in the context of an adversary, Iran, a country at war with the United States until days ago. This is different. This is the exact same category of toolkit, according to credible, sourced, Pulitzer-winning investigative journalism, being deployed against a sovereign NATO ally's autonomous territory. Not a rival, a friend, a treaty partner under the same Article 5 mutual defense commitment that's supposed to mean an attack on one is an attack on all. If the toolkit gets used on friends the same way it gets used on adversaries, that tells you something important about what the toolkit actually is. Let's go through this carefully. Before we get to what Taub uncovered, you need the full arc, because the Greenland story has a longer history than most people realize, and the shape of that history is itself revealing. Trump's interest in acquiring Greenland actually dates back to his first term, 2018 to 2019, when he floated the idea of purchasing the island from Denmark, and it went, by most accounts, nowhere, widely treated as a curiosity, even something of a joke at the time. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen rejected it outright as absurd, and Trump, reportedly stung by the dismissal, canceled a planned state visit to Denmark in response. Fast forward to his second term. The idea didn't just return, it returned with dramatically more force. In December 2025, Trump appointed Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry as a special envoy specifically focused on Greenland, an informal, one-sided role with the explicit stated goal of making Greenland part of the United States. Landry reportedly intended to attend, uninvited, a traditional Greenlandic dog sled race. A small detail, but one that captures something important about the tone of this entire campaign. A mix of genuine geopolitical seriousness and almost cartoonish overreach happening simultaneously. By January 2026, the rhetoric escalated sharply. Trump refused to rule out military force. He posted on Truth Social, demanding NATO tell Denmark to get them out of here now, and repeated a false claim that Danish defense forces in Greenland consisted of, in his words, 2 dog sleds. He threatened a 10% tariff on Denmark and 7 other European nations, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, Finland, starting February 1st, rising to 25% by June 1st, unless Denmark agreed to sell the island. And then came the sentence that I think is the single most important quote in this entire story, because it tells you exactly how Trump himself understands the limits, or lack of limits, on his own authority here. Asked about the legal basis for potentially seizing Greenland, Trump said, "Yeah, there is one thing, my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me. I don't need international law." The New York Times described this as the most blunt acknowledgement yet of his worldview. I don't think that's an overstatement. When the head of state of the most powerful military on Earth says the only constraint on seizing Allied territory is his own personal morality, That's not rhetorical flourish. That's a stated operating principle. European nations responded by actually deploying troops to Greenland, Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and the Netherlands sent forces in a show of support and deterrence, in what amounted to NATO allies militarily reinforcing a member's territory against the possibility of seizure by the alliance's own leading power. Think about how extraordinary that sentence is. NATO allies sending troops to deter a NATO ally's own nuclear umbrella provider. Then, on January 21, 2026, at Davos, Trump reversed course publicly, pledging not to use force or tariffs, and announcing he'd reached what he called a framework of a future deal that would, in his words, accommodate U.S. interests in the long term. The specifics of that framework have never been fully detailed publicly, and there's a detail buried in the British House of Commons library briefing on this entire saga that I think is genuinely important context. Legal experts have suggested that framing the Greenland push specifically around national security grounds may be partly motivated by Trump trying to insulate the effort from domestic legal challenges in U.S. courts. A national security justification is harder to challenge than a straightforward territorial acquisition claim. One more data point before we move to the present. There's a detail connecting this directly to events we've covered elsewhere in this series. Right after the U.S. military operation that captured Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro on January 3, 2026, White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller stated publicly that the United States has the right to take Greenland. His wife, Katie Miller, then a White House official herself, published a map of Greenland covered in the American flag with a single word: soon. That image drew widespread international condemnation. And 17 days earlier, on January 14th, Trump had said this directly, explicitly invoking Venezuela as a precedent. There's not a thing that Denmark can do about it if Russia or China wants to occupy Greenland, but there's everything we can do. You found that out last week with Venezuela. I want you to sit with that sentence specifically because I think it's doing something very deliberate. Trump is citing the Maduro capture, an armed special forces raid against a sovereign government, as evidence of what the United States is capable of doing in the same breath as discussing Greenland. That's not a subtle implication. That's about as close to an explicit statement as you'll get from a sitting president, that the Venezuela operation functions as a demonstrated capability relevant to the Greenland situation. Denmark held a national election in March 2026, called early by Frederiksen specifically to capitalize on her popularity from standing up to Trump. The political effect was real and measurable. Her Social Democrats spiked in early polling, specifically because of her Greenland posture. The final result, though, was more complicated than a simple vindication. Her party won the most votes, but underperformed prior results, with analysts noting it marked the party's worst showing since 1903, even as Greenland's status remained, in the words of one Danish analyst, something that did not play a role at all in shaping the actual ballot box decisions of most voters, who were focused on domestic economic issues. There's a small but genuinely moving detail in NPR's coverage of that election that I want to share, because I think it captures something real about how Danes are processing this entire situation. NPR's Copenhagen correspondent described young Danish voters gathering and singing from a 19th century songbook, specifically a hymn called The Blue Anemone, written by a priest, Kai Munk, as a protest poem during the Nazi occupation of Denmark in World War II. Munk was arrested by the Gestapo and murdered for writing it. Danish students were singing a song of resistance against foreign occupation, written under Nazi rule, in response to pressure from their own NATO ally and supposed protector. That detail alone should tell you something about how seriously this situation is actually being felt inside Denmark, regardless of how lightly it's being treated in American headlines. Also worth noting, Aja Chemnitz, a Greenlandic parliamentarian representing the Inuit Ataqatigiit Party, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize specifically for her work de-escalating tensions between the U.S. and Greenland during this crisis. She didn't win. That prize went to Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who, in a widely covered gesture, handed her prize to President Trump. Chemnitz reportedly joked that if she'd won, she would not be giving hers away. Now we arrive at the heart of this video. What's actually new, what's actually being reported right now, as of this week, that almost nobody is talking about. Ben Taub's reporting, published in the New Yorker, and discussed in detail on NPR's Fresh Air on June 17th, traces the Greenland project from its 2018 origins to the present, and his central finding is this. Even though the issue has largely disappeared from American headlines since the Davos reversal, the effort has not actually stopped. According to Taub, there are ongoing influence operations conducted at Trump's direction, specifically intended to keep the possibility of U.S. acquisition alive. Let me walk you through some of the specific on-the-record details Taub provides, because they tell you something important about how this kind of campaign actually operates in practice, distinct from the formal diplomatic and military pressure track we just covered. Just before Trump's 2025 inauguration, Donald Trump Jr. and the late Charlie Kirk traveled to Nuuk, Greenland's capital, with what Taub describes as very little advance warning. An advance team had gone ahead of them carrying MAGA caps to hand out to locals. Think about the texture of that operation for a second. This is not a State Department delegation. This is not a formal diplomatic visit with credentialed envoys and a published itinerary. This is two politically connected private actors flying into a foreign self-governing territory with merchandise, attempting to build grassroots local support for an American annexation effort among a population of 57,000 people. Taub's reporting goes further, identifying what he describes as a network of private actors who became involved in advancing the acquisition effort for reasons of their own, financial gain, notoriety, or ideological commitment in his framing. I want to be precise here about what I can confirm from secondary reporting and what requires you to go read Taub's original piece directly. The specific identities and motivations of these individual private actors are detailed in his full New Yorker article, which I'd encourage you to read directly rather than rely on a secondhand summary, because that's exactly the kind of granular, sourced reporting where a podcast retelling risks losing the nuance that makes it credible in the first place. What I can tell you with confidence, because it's stated plainly in the interview transcript itself, is that Taub's framing throughout is that this has functioned as a sustained campaign with real institutional behavior behind it. Not a single impulsive comment from Trump that faded away, but an effort with continuity, personnel, and ongoing activity stretching from 2018 to the literal week I'm recording this video. There's also a detail in the original Wall Street Journal episode, the one that first broke the modern phase of this story back in his first term, that Taub discusses. In the lead-up to that initial reporting, the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen had specifically called the Danish Foreign Ministry, requesting a formal invitation from the Danish royal family for Trump and Melania Trump to visit. The intended framing, according to Taub's reporting, was that this would look like Denmark extending the invitation, a royal welcome, which the U.S. would then simply accept, reversing the actual sequence of who was pursuing whom. That's a small detail, but it's revealing about the broader pattern, a consistent effort throughout this entire saga to control the public narrative framing, making an American acquisition campaign look, where possible, like a natural extension of goodwill rather than territorial pressure. Here's where I want to draw the line explicitly, because I think it's the most important analytical point in this entire video. Throughout this series, we've discussed in detail the documented toolkit of soft power influence operations, civil society funding, targeted media campaigns, youth and demographic-specific messaging, private sector and NGO-channeled financial flows. And we've discussed carefully and with appropriate epistemic caution whether that toolkit might be redeployed against Iran following the recent Memorandum of Understanding. In that earlier video, I was deliberately careful to separate documented historical pattern from unverified speculation about the future, because I don't think it's responsible to present a prediction with the same confidence as established fact. Greenland is different, and I think it's actually the more important story for a specific reason. This isn't speculation about a toolkit that might get used somewhere in the future. This is sourced, on the record, Pulitzer winner reported journalism describing a toolkit that has already been used continuously against a U.S. ally's territory for nearly a decade, and according to Taub's most recent reporting, is still being used right now. We don't have to wonder whether the influence operations playbook gets redeployed in unexpected directions. We have documented proof that it already has been, aimed not at an adversary, but at 57,000 Inuit and Danish citizens living on an autonomous Arctic island that happens to sit on top of rare earth minerals and sits directly along emerging Arctic shipping and security corridors that both Russia and China have their own strategic interest in. And I think that should genuinely reframe how you think about every other instance of this toolkit being discussed in international affairs. If the same basic category of campaign, informal envoys, private actors with personal incentives, targeted local outreach, sustained multi-year pressure beneath the surface of formal diplomacy, gets used on a NATO ally with the same structural patterns as it's been documented using on adversarial states elsewhere in modern history, then the relevant question isn't really, is this toolkit being used against country X? The relevant question is, this toolkit exists. It's flexible enough to be aimed in any direction depending on whoever happens to be running it, and Greenland is simply the case where we have the most direct, sourced, recent evidence of how it actually operates in practice. I want to spend a moment on why Greenland is genuinely strategically significant, separate from the more colorful details of the influence campaign, because I think it's easy to read this story as bizarre political theater and miss the substantive reasoning underneath it. Trump has specifically cited Greenland as a necessary site for the United States Golden Dome missile defense system, the layered air and missile defense architecture his administration has prioritized. Greenland already hosts Patuxent Space Base, a long-standing U.S. military installation, under the existing 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement, which itself built on a 1941 U.S.-Danish agreement that explicitly recognized Danish sovereignty over the island while allowing American defense of it during the Nazi occupation of Denmark, a historical irony worth noting, given that modern Danish resistance songs from that same occupation period are now being sung in protest of American pressure on the same territory. Greenland also sits on substantial untapped mineral resources, including rare earth elements increasingly central to advanced manufacturing, defense technology, and the broader U.S.-China strategic competition over critical minerals supply chains, a topic we've discussed in this series' coverage of China's broader resource and technology positioning. And geographically, as Arctic ice recedes, Greenland's position along emerging northern shipping routes and its proximity to both Russian and increasingly active Chinese Arctic operations gives it a strategic relevance that genuinely exceeds what its tiny population would otherwise suggest. None of that justifies the specific tactics described in Taub's reporting, but it does explain why this isn't simply an eccentric personal fixation. There's a real, defensible strategic logic underneath the campaign, even if the methods used to pursue it, according to credible reporting, have included pressuring an ally with tariffs, refusing to rule out military force, and running sustained informal influence operations against a self-governing territory's local population. Here's the uncomfortable structural question sitting underneath this entire story, and I think it deserves to be asked plainly rather than danced around. NATO's Article 5 states that an armed attack against one member is considered an attack against all. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, a NATO member. If the country whose troops form the backbone of NATO's own deterrent capability is simultaneously the country refusing to rule out military force against a member state's territory, what does that actually do to the coherence of the entire alliance's mutual defense logic? European nations already answered that question with action, not just words, sending their own troops to Greenland specifically to deter the alliance's leading member from seizing Allied territory. That has, as far as I'm aware, no real precedent in NATO's history. I don't think this story resolves into a clean, simple verdict. The Davos reversal suggests there are real limits, whatever they actually are, on how far this goes. Trump did pull back from the tariff threats and the explicit military option, at least publicly, after European and Danish pushback. But Taub's reporting tells us the pressure didn't actually stop. It just moved beneath the surface into exactly the kind of informal, deniable, multi-actor influence campaign that this entire video series has spent weeks tracking in other contexts. The fact that it's harder to see doesn't mean it's less real. If anything, based on everything else we've covered in this series, the move from loud public pressure to quiet, sustained influence operations is usually the sign that a campaign is settling in for the long term, not winding down. 5 things, because this story has more independent moving parts than most we've covered. First, watch for Greenland's own self-government independence report, expected by the end of 2026. Greenland has the right, under its 2009 Home Rule Agreement with Denmark, to hold a referendum on full independence whenever it chooses. The expected report will outline possible paths to that independence. If Greenland moves seriously toward independence, the entire structure of this dispute changes. The U.S. would then theoretically be negotiating directly with a newly sovereign Arctic nation, rather than pressuring a piece of an existing NATO ally, which could either simplify or dramatically complicate Washington's actual objectives, depending on how it's handled. Second, watch for any further New Yorker or comparable investigative reporting naming the specific private actors Taub references. If additional outlets corroborate or expand on the network of individuals involved, that moves this from a single well-sourced piece of journalism into a broader, multiply-confirmed pattern, which is exactly the evidentiary bar we discussed in our episode on the Bangladesh-Iran question. Right now, Taub's reporting is the primary documented source. Watch whether it stays that way or gets independently corroborated. Third, watch the tariff threshold dates. The original threat structure involved escalating tariffs through specific 2026 calendar dates. Even though Trump publicly reversed course at Davos, watch whether any of that tariff architecture gets quietly reactivated or referenced again, particularly if Denmark or Greenland take any action Washington interprets unfavorably. For instance, a serious independence push that doesn't lead toward the outcome the U.S. wants. Fourth, watch Pituffik Space Base specifically and any reporting on expanded U.S. military construction or personnel presence there. A formal request for expanded basing rights, separate from any sovereignty discussion, would be a concrete, measurable indicator of how the practical military relationship is evolving, regardless of what's happening in the political and influence operations layer. Fifth, watch how this story interacts with the Arctic policies of Russia and China. Part of the stated justification for American interest in Greenland has consistently been countering Russian and Chinese Arctic ambitions. Watch whether either country makes any new public statement or strategic move regarding Greenland or the broader Arctic specifically in response to this ongoing U.S. pressure campaign. That reaction, or the absence of one, will tell you how seriously Moscow and Beijing are actually taking Washington's Arctic posture. Go read Ben Taub's full New Yorker article, Inside the Ludicrous, Deadly Serious Plan to Take Over Greenland, directly. I've given you the broad strokes from the NPR Fresh Air interview, but Taub's full reporting contains the specific named individuals, the specific financial details, and the specific operational history that a second-hand summary like this video genuinely cannot do justice to. This is exactly the kind of story where primary source reading matters enormously, because the credibility of the entire claim rests on sourcing details that I'd be doing you a disservice to flatten into a simplified retelling. Then, go find the original House of Commons library briefing on Trump and Greenland. It's a remarkably clear, neutral, chronological summary of the entire dispute from a non-American, non-partisan parliamentary research source. And it's a useful cross-check against any single outlet's framing, American or Danish. If you have information about this story that goes beyond what's in this video, particularly anything connecting the Greenland influence campaign to the same institutional toolkit we've discussed elsewhere in this series, tell me in the comments with sources. This is a story that deserves far more sustained attention than it's currently getting, precisely because it's been crowded out by louder headlines from Geneva and Hormuz and Kyiv. Sometimes the story that isn't trending is the one that matters most. I'll see you in the next one.